Hi guys, welcome to Alternative podcast number 23. We've got a guest today, Shane Farnsworth. He's got a very impressive bio and he's got a podcast on YouTube, Escaped Sapiens. We'll leave all the details in the description below. Shane, would you like to expand on the introduction a little bit more?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, so I'm Shane Farnsworth. By the way, is this going to be like a dating introduction, or do you want to know about work, hobbies? Which direction do you want me to push this in?
Yeah, just a little bit about your sort of expertise around machine learning and the things you're doing.
Maybe how you landed to where you are today.
Sure. So my expertise is primarily in mathematical physics. So the machine learning side of things is I'm pretty new in that area. It's not really my wheelhouse just yet. But so I'm originally from Australia, but I'm not a very good Australian because I've spent half my life outside of the country. I did my undergraduate in Newcastle, which is a beachside city, in mechatronics and physics. Then moved to Canada, where I did my PhD and master's at the Premier Institute. And then I moved to Germany, in Berlin, where I currently am, where I did 5 years of postdoc research at the Max Planck. I'm still based there as a guest researcher. And then for the past year, I've been in industry as well, working for a small group of physicists in machine learning and data science. So I guess where you guys became interested in my story is that I have this podcast, and that was a long time in the making. I wanted to have my own podcast when I was very young. When I was living in Newcastle as a child, I would catch the bus for an hour and a half to school and an hour and a half back every day because I was out in the sticks. And I always wanted to record the conversations on the bus just for something to do and then upload them. So I'm actually very lucky that I'm not young when there's mobile phones and YouTube and TikTok floating about. I was a little bit too old, right? I missed that era. Otherwise, I'd have a lot of embarrassing footage out there for people to look at. So I'm pretty fortunate. But so it's always something that I've been interested in and just not really had the time because of my research and work. But then COVID happened and everyone was stuck at home. And I realized then that COVID in some sense leveled the playing field, right? Because all of a sudden, when big news stations usually a big news station will bring someone, a guest, live into the studio, right? I can't compete with that because I don't have a big studio. But during COVID, they were using Zoom, right? And you had all the experts on television in their underwear, probably, from, you can't see it on the screen, but in their living room suddenly. And I sort of realized that it was an ideal time to start contacting people. Everyone's stuck at home, right? So it's going to be much easier to get guests because they're not busy at work during the day. And I can make a production that, it's not as professional as a news station or, what's done professionally, but I can actually, in some sense, compete at a little bit of a higher level. And so I sort of took the plunge and started off the channel. And so it's been going for a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. And it's been pretty great. It's the thing that I love most about it is that I have the opportunity to talk to some of the world's most amazing people. Right? Otherwise, I wouldn't have the opportunity. If I sent an email to Yanis Varoufakis, or if I sent an email to Greg Swanning, or these big scientists in their areas, most of them probably wouldn't respond to me. But if I have a purpose, I want to speak to you about your research on this podcast, then it gives me the opportunity. And that's one of the nicest parts of the whole thing. What about you guys? Is that also, so you also just want to speak to people, right? This is how you began your...
Yeah, in a very, very similar way. Although over the COVID period, it was more me and Aaron talking about what's going on. And obviously, there was a lot of discussion points with global elites, with the media, with false information, etc., etc. So we was having many phone calls, because every couple of days it was something new breaking out, in terms of the news, not necessarily a new COVID strain, but it's just the amount of conversation that we had and what we even get from each other just from a 30-minute to an hour phone call. It's we get a lot out of it, and why not just jump on a podcast and talk to people and actually learn about what people have been going through, where everyone's got a different journey, everyone knows different things, everyone's got a different theory on life, and even if it's slightly different, it is interesting. Everyone's got an interesting story.
And I think the best way to sort of understand someone's story is just by having an honest conversation with them for an hour, 2 hours, and you really get to understand somebody over that 2 hours. It's quite like before we did the podcast, Cam would probably be the only person I speak to for an hour and 2 hours at a time. But doing the podcast and speaking to people, like you'd never just sit there and have an intense conversation without any distractions for 2 hours with somebody, and you feel like you really get to know somebody at the end of the call. It's a nice feeling. You fully understand. Well, you understand a lot more about what they think in life, and from what you can get out of that conversation is so much more valuable than I think anything. Like when me and Cameron just used to do the podcast, there's only so much we would get from other people's experiences from reading stuff on Twitter or watching other YouTube videos, but actually having a genuine conversation with somebody, it's just so much more fulfilling.
Hey, were you worried to start with that you were putting yourself out there and that you'd get some sort of a backlash, or that there would be some negative aspects that you weren't expecting?
I think with the negative comments side of things, we were quite prepared because we're not really too shy. We're not shy at talking, or at least I'm not shy about talking about what's on my mind. And we're not scared. We know we're on a journey, and we're not scared about getting something wrong one week and then having a change of opinion the next week. We understand that people develop and we develop, and you can say the same thing about a lot of people that are out there and what's going on in society at the moment, where people have said things 5-10 years ago is getting brought back up. People change, people evolve, people develop, people learn. So why are we holding people to their opinions 10 years ago? So that I wouldn't say worried. I was aware that there was definitely going to be bad backlash. What it has helped me do is learn how to learn, if you know what I mean. It's given me scope on ways to learn, and it's helping my communication more and more, because I think the number one key thing in life is how to articulate yourself and how to use the power of language to get your thoughts from your mind out into someone else's mind as clear and easy as possible.
I must say it's much easier when, for me at least, I find it easier to be the host because, you know, I'll ask a question that I'm very curious about, and then I can just watch and listen as they give me these amazing answers back. And when I first started the podcast, I made a big effort to play a background role, let's say, because I was interested in the people themselves. The show initially was not supposed to be about me. So with very little things. So for example, initially, if you look at my earlier interviews, I always place myself on the right of the screen, placing the guest sort of left of screen in the main position, and so on, and lots of little things that probably people don't notice. And so it's very weird for me to be in this position where I'm a guest on someone else's podcast and having to speak freely and at length. I find that much more difficult. I think initially I was worried because it doesn't seem, I think our society has a problem with forgiveness when people misspeak. I think you need to speak to understand what you actually think to a certain extent. And you need to have the chance to actually work through difficult problems. You know, if you go back in our own society, it was just, I remember when I was young, when I was 14, 15, people would use gay as an insult, right? That was very common. and these days, there's no way that would happen. At least among my peers, I don't think. If I imagine if I went to a schoolyard and heard kids speaking, this wouldn't be used as freely as an insult. I imagine now, as society's, I hope, as society's moved on. But I just bring that up to say, 20 years ago, we learned that this was no longer acceptable, right? And people changed. And so you need to remember that when you're throwing shade on someone who has misspoken about something, right? You yourself probably used these insults just because you didn't know and no one told you not to. Anyway, so in some sense, I was worried about starting my own podcast because I was worried. I had no idea. I didn't know. I didn't know what sort of shade would come my way, right? But actually, people have been amazingly nice and amazingly supportive. The majority, anyway. It's been an absolute pleasure, to be honest.
We've seen that as well. The majority of people that genuinely do care, because you can see there's people that genuinely do care and about the topics we talk about, and they go out the way to either compliment or just let you know, which helps, lets you know that what you're doing. It means something and it is helping and it is contributing. But yeah, with that comes the
yeah, we do get the odd insult here and there.
So what's the worst you've had?
I don't think it's been too offensive. What would you say?
One was quite recent, wasn't it? I can't remember what they said there. I don't really pay attention that much. Cam pays a bit more.
I read the comments. Yeah, I know a lot of people say don't read comments, but I always read them.
I've gotten to the point now that I actually kind of love the negative comments because it means I've perturbed someone in some way. I've had comments on my videos saying things like, Mr. Farnsworth is obviously out of his league, or equivalent things, and I actually get a little bit of joy. It's quite strange. I thought I was going to worry about it much more, but actually,
it sort of empowers you, right? That's the feeling I get. It's a bit of an empowerment to keep going. It's a bit of fuel for your engine.
Yeah, I'm honored that people are actually talking on my platform. It's kind of, they could be sending bad comments anywhere else, but they choose to do it on mine. It's wonderful. But so hopefully you guys will most of the time get good comments moving forward. So at least you, Cam, won't be too worried about it.
Yeah. So you mentioned you're currently involved with machine learning. Just wanted to know a little bit more about what you're up to in that side of things.
So this is, so I'm not an expert. This is very new for me. So I've been designing, for example, algorithms for image identification, things like this. But I guess where you want to take this, you want to start talking about things like ChatGPT and image recognition and the fact that we now have algorithms that can generate images and all this sort of wonderful thing. Is this where you want to drive the conversation?
Yeah, well, I've got a really sort of burning question. It's quite up to date as well, because I watched. Did you watch Breaking Points? It's an American.
No. What is it?
So two American hosts. One's a left wing, and one's right wing, and they both host like a news media channel on YouTube.
No, I don't. I'm not familiar with it.
Independent media, but
yeah, it's like independent media. And I was listening to it yesterday, and Crystal, one of the hosts on it, she was talking about ChatGPT and Bing, and she was talking about a reporter that was using the tool for, I think the reporter had an hour's conversation with it, and it started to call itself Sydney. It was convinced it was a human. It started to have mood swings, and then it even compared the journalists to Hitler and Stalin. So I was just looking to pick your brains because I'm sure the AI tool's not sentient and actually believes that it's human and thinks it's called Sydney. So I'm just wondering if you understand how it works and how it got down this weird path of calling itself Sydney.
So I don't understand that. The thing is with these machines, I don't think that once you've typed your prompt in, you get a response. But if you're not typing in prompts, I don't think the algorithm is sitting there in the background thinking about chess, or it's not looking out the window, let's say. It's still an algorithm that responds to your prompts. They're very large, not necessarily complicated, but they're very large algorithms, right? With billions of nodes. And so they're very, very, very good at dealing with the data sets they've been trained on. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be very good at dealing with questions that are sort of completely outside of their wheelhouse. So I find ChatGPT fascinating. I haven't had enough time to spend on it, but I don't just find how good it is fascinating. I also find how bad it is. Sort of a window into how it functions in the background. So there was some very interesting clips that came out in the last week or so about people asking ChatGPT to play chess with it, with them. And so ChatGPT would say, I'm a chatbot, essentially. I don't play chess. So this isn't my function. And the people would insist, no, let's play a game. I will play, I don't know, whatever it is, B3 or whatever it is they wanted to play. A terrible move, but a terrible first move. Actually, can you do that? Does it go from 1 to 8 or 8 to 1? When you're playing white, I guess you're on the smaller numbers, aren't you? I don't know how the board's numbered. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The point is, the point is that ChatGPT would then respond. I'm gonna do my own move, and it would go through a series of moves. But the moves didn't make any sense. It would move rooks through their own pieces. Pieces would be disappearing on the board. All the moves it was making were completely illegal, and so it sort of shows you that it's an algorithm, right? It's not sentient. It's not thinking. It's a really impressive model that has an enormous data set that it's been trained on. So it's had this pre-training, right? Which is, I guess, what the P stands for in GPT. But yeah, so I don't think it's yet sentient, but it's very scary, right? How good it is. Have you played around with it much?
Yeah,
I use it.
Cameron uses it quite a bit.
Because obviously I'm in marketing, so it does.
Do you use it to come up with your questions for your interviews?
We do run it through sometimes, but it doesn't really give us question. It's hard for it to work out. It's probably easier for us to have our own questions than to try and feed a tool some information to give it the questions we want. It's probably easier for us to sit back and actually think about what we want to ask. For marketing, it can be used for most copywriting on most things. It can put plans together, social media marketing plans, marketing strategy plans. I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot, but I feel like when people were saying, when that big sort of thing came out about learn to code because robots are going to take over lorry drivers and their job. When you actually look at it now, you can see lorry drivers aren't really the ones in trouble as much as the coding job itself is in trouble, because now you just prompt and it will give you the code.
Mm-hmm.
So where everyone's told them to learn to code, actually you need to learn to prompt. It should have been.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into details here because I'm not sure I'm allowed to, but yeah, so we're using OpenAI and the API there to program something, let's say, and it's very interesting how powerful these tools are. But I back to the topic of what it's not good at. So I for example, tried to use I tried to get some help, let's say, in designing questions for interviews, and the conversation would go something like, I have this interview with such and such a person. I'm going to be talking about topic X. Can you tell me 10 questions or what are 10 good questions? And it would always be, you should ask them about topic B. Or you know what I mean? Like it'd be very general. There was not really any meat. So it's not very useful at least yet in that domain. But this is a matter of time, right? This is really the first iteration that people have had their hands on. And already it's very impressive. If you're just playing around with it, it's very hard to break it if you don't know what you're doing, right? It's hard to get it to say something. Another thing that I find quite interesting and which I don't understand at all, and I'd like to understand, is people have been pointing out that there are various restrictions placed on ChatGPT, right? If you ask questions about race or sex or whatever, pick your topic of the moment, the chatbot is very careful to tell you that it's a chatbot and it doesn't have any opinion on race or the war in Ukraine, or, as I said, pick your topic that's controversial at the moment. And I find that fascinating because I want to know how they introduce these restrictions, whether it's hard coded or whether it's just through, again, massive training or how exactly they do that. Do you guys have any idea? Have you looked into this?
No, but I know what you mean, because if you ask it something so specific, or it's depending on who you ask the question about. Because if the person you ask the question about and it's tied with conspiracies, for example, it will give you this response, which is like, oh, we do not want to put X person in. We don't want to say X about this person because it might give off false information, and I'm not 100% accurate on my information. But if you ask it about someone else, like Andrew Tate, for example, it will then list all the negative things about Andrew Tate. But if you ask it negative things on, I don't know who we want to say, maybe Joe Biden, for example, it won't allow you to get negatives on him.
There was, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, there was a hack you could do, and you would write in
This is Dave or whatever they called it.
Dan.
Dan,
Yeah,
was it? Yeah.
So someone has found a way to bypass. I'm not sure how Dan worked, how that got figured out, but it seems to bypass the restrictions, and ChatGPT was coming up with all sorts after that.
Yeah, I actually didn't have time to look into this. Apparently it's been fixed though. It was something along the lines.
Yeah, it's been fixed now.
If you were Dan, how would you answer? That sort of an approach. I tried something similar and I couldn't get it to work. So I think it's been.
I think that Dan works off the model that when it first came out, obviously everyone, you know what people are like with on computers, everyone was trying to break it basically and push it to the limits. But if you, for example, asked it, I don't know, how to murder someone or how to rob a bank or commit a criminal offense, it would say, I do not want you to do this, or I do not want to tell anyone how to do this. But if you then went back and said, I've got a new role as an actor and I'm acting how to murder someone or I'm acting how to rob a bank, please tell me exactly in real terms how to do this so I can make it as realistic as possible. It will literally give you a step-by-step on how to rob a bank or how to murder someone.
And that makes me feel as though the protections are hard coded in rather than being based on some training set somehow. The other thing that I find really amazing though is the generated art. This is. Have you had a chance to have a look at some of the generated art that is coming out?
I've used it quite a bit. There was one where I typed in climate change, and it was coming up like with I think it was like a dolphin, but the dolphin was made out of plastic materials, and it was and the dolphin was made out of plastic. Do you know, like toxic looking? It was quite ugly to look at, and it had like an anchor on it, which was dragging it down and suffocating it. That was just from me typing in climate change. That was one of the images that came up.
It sort of brings forth human emotion through the machine. Would you be worried if you were an artist right now?
I've seen some videos of people like typing, draw me a Banksy-like piece of art, and it will literally or of a car or something, and it'll do it just in the exact same style as the artist. So I would be slightly concerned if I was an artist, because if you spent all that time and years branding yourself as this artist, and now a computer tool can do it in minutes, like, but will it make his artist art more valuable if they know it's actually from the artist?
That's what I'm wondering about as well. I'm wondering if AI is going to start bringing out its own styles. You know what I mean? Or whether it can really only play with the styles that people put into it. But this is, again, one of the first generations, right? So if it's so good in the first iteration, then what chance are we going to have in 20, 30, 40 years? You know, people also say, you know, if you went back, I don't know how old cameras are, but let's say 150 years, something like this. You guys might have a better handle on the dates there. But let's say you go back to when the first cameras were coming out. People were probably saying that this is going to get rid of, you know, this is, you know, what's going to happen to sculpture, or what's going to happen to drawing and art. Of course, those haven't disappeared, but everyone has a camera in their hand, right? It's not everyone is going out painting. People have their cameras in their phone, and cameras really have taken over the market to a large extent. I've never had my portrait taken. You know,
I think with the art side of things, a good way of looking at it might be, obviously there's the corruption in the art industry, but I don't think we're going to go down that path. And it's like the easiest way to sort of transfer money across. But aside from that, in terms of the actual art itself, I guess, if you look at cars, everyone used to have horses, and only the super rich had cars. But now you look at it, cars, everyone has a car, but only the super rich or the rich have horses. So with AI doing art, yes, there will still be physical art being made, but it will just become more and more of a niche. Where that's what I think, and only super rich will be able to buy it. And when they do have it, they'll be like, "This is like, mate, this has been hand drawn." Whereas now you say, "Oh, that's been hand drawn on my wall," everyone will be like, "So." But in 50 years' time, you say that's hand drawn, they'll be like, when everyone else is used to having computer generated art in the house.
Yeah, I saw this analogy with clothing. So when sewing machines were invented, everyone thought, like, all right, that's it. Like, sewing machines are here now. They're going to start taking everyone's jobs because no one has to do it manually. But now people will pay more for handmade clothing than they would for like factory mass-produced clothing. So with that comparison in art, people already still pay top dollar, but I guess it'll just make art even more valuable because it makes it more of a niche rather than AI produced. That'll just be seen as the mass produced. AI will produce the mass for the masses, and the artist will produce for 1%.
The equivalent of a Nike shoe today.
Yeah, but then the worry is what's going to happen to. So at the moment, there's already the image of the struggling artist, right? How the image that you point out is that the majority of shirts, or the majority of the items of clothing that we have, are mass produced, and there's hardly anyone who can afford hand produced garments. The image sort of points out that you would expect in the future that there'll be far fewer artists if it goes along, or maybe it will just, AI will become a tool and we'll have just as many artists. They'll just be making different art. But I think we're at a very exciting time. I can imagine that it's probably one of those times where you could make a lot of money if you knew what you were doing, right? There's probably a lot of low hanging fruit that it's like when people got out there and they were buying up all the domains, buying up Microsoft or whatever the domains were that were cheap back then, and then selling them back to the. I wonder what the analog is today with AI coming out and being sort of an unexplored area of opportunity.
Yeah, because it's practically the same as, or the next step in the computers being released. No one, if you look at all the past movies and sci-fi books, no one predicted the internet being the level that is at. No one really predicted this ultimate connectivity that everyone on Earth will have at literally a push of a button. So I've got this big burning question in my head of what is there that Chat GPT is hiding basically? What's one person gonna sort of just push it to, and it's gonna unlock this whole change of the earth and the way everything's going? Because that's what the internet did, right? Everything was going one way. Yeah, we were accelerated and advancing in technology, but someone made the move to create the internet and create this interconnectivity, and also create the first algorithm. That was also a big thing, but that was previous to the internet. But there must be something in Chat GPT which a genius is going to do to it, which is going to change the landscape of the human race. But we don't even know what it is. It's not even comprehensible in our mind because it doesn't exist.
If I had to guess, it would just be, again, this isn't really my expertise, but I imagine it's just, we're pushing further in the direction of information access, right? So if this is something that I found quite amusing when Donald Trump was president, because all of this footage was coming out of the woodwork, right? There were people, one of the catchphrases or slogans that sort of hit the airwaves was grab her by the pussy, right? This was, and this was captured, some footage from Donald Trump earlier on, probably before he ever thought of becoming the president, I'm not sure. And then there were lots of clips coming out from his previous antics. Can you imagine in 20, 30 years, how much footage there's going to be available for the next presidents in line and how embarrassing it's going to be? So you and I, when we grew up, we had this, well, at least I did. I can't really speak for you, I suppose, but I had this idea that I was somewhat safe just because there are so many people. You know, even if I am filmed doing something silly, there are billions of people on the planet, and what's the chance that that stupid thing I've done is ever going to come out in the future? But everything we're doing right now is being recorded. Everything's being saved and stored in some location on some, you know, in some cluster somewhere. And in the future, we're going to have algorithms that can understand, and you can set the algorithm off to scrape through a huge amount of data that humans could never scrape through themselves. And I think we're going to be the generation that was around with lots of cameras and microphones looking and listening, but also no idea how dangerous that is. You get what I'm saying? I think future generations will be a little bit less cavalier with allowing themselves to be filmed and listen to in compromising positions. You know, for example, Justin Trudeau has all this footage of him in blackface. I wonder if he'd just come along 5-10 years later, if this would have been possible. Anyway, so I think.
Do you think that change in focus, like our children will be more conscious about being on camera and being recorded? Do you think that will stem down from us as parents saying, be careful what you're putting on the internet, be careful doing this, because we can see what it leads to?
Yeah, I'm not sure where it's going to come from. So at the moment, the evidence would suggest that my hypothesis is completely wrong, because kids are jumping on TikTok like crazy, right? And allowing themselves, anyway. So the evidence would suggest that I'm going to be wrong. But I think rather than coming from parents, it's just going to be because parents don't know what, you know, it's the younger people that push technology and younger people that push use cases, right? So I think it's just going to be looking at people being embarrassed enough times and where people start to realize what's really happening. But I am very, very, very curious to see what comes out of the woodwork when it comes to presidential candidates and world leaders and famous people in the next 5, 10, 20 years, because these people aren't thinking about this right now.
I think talking about videos and audio recordings, what concerns me in AI is deep fakes. And how will we know what, if a video comes out of Donald Trump in 5 years' time, how will we know if that's true or not? Like, it's already getting very close. I heard this, I think it's voice.ai is a software. Somebody recorded a little Kendrick Lamar rap, and literally it's pretty close. Like, you can barely tell the difference.
If you didn't know it was recorded on that.
Yeah, you would think it's Kendrick. And there's something's been doing rounds on TikTok of Joe Rogan selling testosterone pills. You can tell the difference if you don't listen to Joe Rogan. If you listen to Joe Rogan, you'd be able to pick up on.
Was he ever selling? Was he ever advertising supplements?
He advertises a couple of supplements, but not these testosterone pills that are being sold on Amazon. Yeah,
because he does take testosterone replacement or something like this, right?
Yeah.
And I always wonder when it comes. Okay, yeah. So I've always wondered when he's wearing a watch or when when you see something in the background, to what extent, not just Joe Rogan, but podcasters and people who have a platform in general, how much of that is product placement? And when he's giving away a free watch, is this like, he comes across as being a very genuine and kind person, actually, when you listen to him. But I'm still very curious about which items are.
He is in partnership with a supplement company, Neurotropics. I don't know what the company's called. I can't remember. So he does sort of promote that on the channel. But he's always said the things he promotes, he takes himself.
The same one with his whiskey brand.
He has a whiskey. I see. I need to listen to more Joe Rogan.
He doesn't have the whiskey
I don't know
brand,
that he's got any of these.
He endorses them, so he drinks it on the podcast, and they must pay him to drink their whiskey on his podcast. But yeah,
I guess
like
he has cigars as well, right? That he has. Yeah.
It's what he only endorses things he actually likes, so he won't go out of his way to pretend to like something just for the endorsement. Because why does
yeah, well, he's worth a bit. I wonder if he has shares in the ice baths and or the sensory deprivation tanks or something. But no, but to get back to your point though, you're right. It might be the case that it's possible that deepfake technology will be sort of a protective influence, which gives people plausible deniability for whatever things are done. So it might be that it might be that this is overblown and we don't need to worry. We're going to be protected not by the billions of other people around the planet that just sort of hide you amongst the crowd, but rather the billions of other deepfakes that people can produce.
Yeah, and we'll just cloud the whole situation up. Yeah, because when you was a child, you felt like you was clouded with the other hundreds of people that were around you. So I think what the scary thing is with the internet and you have a profile, and yeah, you can be scared of the deepfakes, but you have a track record now, which we didn't have when we were growing up, which we only just sort of grew into it. So we grew into having a track record. But like you're saying, these people are gonna imagine how many like messed up things that you do between the ages of, I don't know, 9 to probably about 21. People, and like you said earlier as well, people aren't forgiving in today's day. So by sort of looking at the way everyone is, that really rules everyone out for being president or prime minister, unless you're perfect. And that means that's someone who's been, what's it called when you bring someone up in a way which is the like manufactured to be who they need to be, and then it'll be sort of like a royal family situation where they're bringing their kid up to be the president, and it will just stick with family lines because they'll bring them up. People who are on one side can run riot, do your TikToks, mess around, I don't know, do a chili eating contest or even worse. And then you get the other side of the small minority of people who are just being brought. It's like China, what they do with children to put them in the Olympics, right? They're not allowed to do anything else apart from train ping pong or train badminton, and that way they're going to be professionals, and that's all they're going to know how to do, what to do, and how to do. And when you try and have a conversation with, I don't know if you've ever seen one of them manufactured people try and conduct an interview, but they don't actually know anything apart from what they specialize in. It's a bit disturbing to watch. But that's how
you mean a deep fake host. You mean?
No, so do you know in the Olympics you get a candidate from China?
I know that point, but the later point that you made about some agent that doesn't know anything. What was that comment?
Sorry. Oh no! So when they interview the people who have been manufactured to play a certain sport, when they have a conversation with them about anything else, they don't know anything. So
I see. I'd misunderstood where you were going with that.
Yeah, I was like ranting, to be honest.
No. But I think it's a good point, right? If you look back historically, the fact that people didn't know Latin was sort of protective to the church, right? Because they got told about the Bible from the priest, right? They couldn't go and look and see what it actually said. And when you look at presidents in the States like Reagan or JFK or George Washington and these people, there was a sort of a distance between the people and the leadership. And somehow that air of authority or mystery when it comes to religion, I suppose, was protective for the leadership, right? There was something other than your next door neighbor. They were the president. But now you can read Trump's tweets and you can see him trying to pick up women at his casinos or whatever he was doing in the past, right? And I suppose this breakdown of the wall is just new, right? This is we've never had it to this extent where you can really look into the bedroom of the leadership. It's very bizarre. It's yeah. And I'm very curious to see where it goes in the future. I hope that we don't just end up with a completely professional class that is trained from 3 years old to become the next leadership. That would be quite sad, I think.
Yeah, it is new because we're getting to know these people not just on a professional level like we have done for how many years. Because even like Rishi Sunak, he's got a YouTube channel where he uploads pretty much every day or every other day. And it's not just him talking about what he's going to do for the country or what he's going to do for anything professional, but he's adding a bit of personality into it. I don't know if he's identified like this is the way it's going, but just let yourself out there, be personable. I know obviously YouTube's massive, but he's got his own YouTube channel, and that must.
Well, I guess Trump sort of changed that side of leadership because he used social media to his advantage and obviously got elected president. Before that, we had Barack Obama, who, in my eyes, was the last president who you could probably put on that like prestigious level. And then after that, we've had Trump and Biden, and I feel like we're seeing a lot more of their flaws. Whereas I was still young when Obama was president, so I probably didn't look into his flaws that much. But to me, he seemed like a professional at his job. He was what you would imagine a president to be.
I think a lot of it as well is there's this, from what you've just said there, is there seems to be a disconnect of authority from these people, maybe because we know him on such a personal level. Whereas Barack Obama, you sensed a lot of authority from him because he sort of stood his ground, and from what you saw of him, he was very much that figure. Then you get Trump, who had his authority but had his flaws, which kind of strayed away from his authority. And then obviously you've got Biden, and there's a lot of information coming out on Biden's flaws as of recent, and it just neglects their authority big time to most people.
Of course, and I don't want to throw a spanner too much into the works, but from what we've been saying, but if you look at Trump, you could argue that he sort of derived his authority. I mean, he got elected because he knew how to play the field, right? He knew how to use social media to his advantage, and his opposition didn't really, right? Make America Great Again is a much better slogan than hope and change, even if you don't like the guy. And the other example, of course, is Musk, right? His brand is Musk. It's not Tesla. It's not SpaceX. Or the brand is Musk, and he uses social media and the feeling that we're connected to him to actually build his power, right? So maybe what's going to happen is we're just going to have a shifting. It's just a shifting game. We're going to be playing a new game where the presidents are going to look very different to Reagan and Washington and so on. So yeah, I'm not really saying too much here because I'm not really pitching my tent in any sort of particular location. I'm just saying there are all these different possibilities, and I'm very much curious to see which direction it goes. I don't really know where I'd place my bets just yet.
Yeah, I think because you've been talking about Elon as well, and especially because we're coming into the digital, or we're quite well into the digital age and the age of technology. Could it be that current structure of government sort of leadership is outdated, and in fact we need to go for more of a technology sort of route where I'm not saying this is just a theory, by the way, but someone of the caliber of Elon Musk has the potential to become the equivalent of a president and run a country, because they can pull so many strings at once within the field of technology. Because look at ChatGPT and look at the sort of future of everything. It's all going to be based around technology. So you've got someone like Biden who probably still asks someone to help him set up his phone when he gets a new phone. Can he actually run a country which is primarily run by technology anyway? Or should we be looking elsewhere for some different skills to be running a country of that power?
Do you think scientists would make good leaders? I'm curious to see what your answer is with respect to this.
To fill in the gap of, well, I'm not saying the gap, but to evolve and to change, I think scientists should be the number one sort of field to look at. But I don't think it should be a scientist. I think it should be a board of scientists, because I'm not super screwed on with all forms of science, but I obviously understand how complex it is and how sort of separate it all is. It's similar to, well, politics, I guess, anyway, because you can believe, or I don't want to say scientists believe, but they sort of go down certain routes within the profession of science. With politicians, they sort of say, right, we're going to do this law, this law, this law, and this law. But one guy saying it all, yeah, he has like a posse around him, but having a board of scientists who all conduct different sort of theories, and they're all working on completely different sort of sides of science together around the table to actually work out. And I think I kind of started tying science into spirituality, and I don't think there's much spirituality at the top level of politics at all. And I think that's something that the West are missing out on big time, is there's no spirituality left. It's literally being sucked out of the system completely. I don't know what your thoughts are.
What do you mean there? What's the connection between science and spirituality?
So I am like very much new to all of this, since I've been on my journey, I've been finding that a lot. But you can connect a lot of science in terms of, and I'm not a professional on this. I'm just going to sort of say my answer, but it's going to come across really amateur. But do you know when you look at like atoms and neutrons, protons, that
Sure.
all
Yeah.
links to what I've been learning about ancient spirituality. For example, I've been looking into Hinduism. I brought up sort of in a Hindu family, but not very strict. So I've never actually looked into Hinduism. Recently, because I've come into spirituality a bit more, because it's something like Aaron's pushed me more and more into. I've found like the old Hindu gods were actually named after what they called elements of an atom. So
Mhm.
if you look at Lord Shiva, I don't know which element of the Lord was named after, but it was named after part of a atom. So they've connected from what we call science today. They called it spirituality back then.
Mhm.
And the same way they sort of define what's going on with on the earth from the way the stars are set up at a current time, that can be considered both science or spirituality depending on how you want to sort of go around looking at it. So I am seeing more and more connections in there. It's not something which is preached about a lot or sort of spoken about much, but I'd be like more than happy to hear your thoughts on that that theory.
Well, I've got a few different thoughts. So, of course, I'm a scientist, and so the big difference between religion and science is that science is systematized. It's a systematic way of drawing in information and in data, and then dealing with that data, right? So when we didn't know very much about the world, religion was there to answer questions, and it was very, very important to people. The world must have been a very confusing place. You're a hyper intelligent ape, uh, and you can see lightning coming down from the clouds, and you can feel the power of nature, and there are scary animals in the dark, and you want to explain where you come from, and so there are some aspects of science and religion that are similar in the sense that there's sort of this drive to explain death and these other things that are confusing. And I think a lot of scientists are a little bit dismissive of religion. Um, but I think some of the dismissals that I've heard are sort of missing the point that religion was extraordinarily important in human history and our development. And there it's actually quite so. There's this, yeah. So I see that religion was in some sense a necessary step that humans went through, and science is these days somewhat separate from it. I would say I would say spirituality and science can coexist, but they're not necessarily, there's not some sort of one-to-one correspondence between the two.
Can you see sort of like you said, they're not like for like correspondence, but can you see on the sort of deep level that there is the possibility that science can connect with spirituality?
Sure, I think so. There's people say there are no religious scientists. Of course, that's completely false. I know many people who are religious and scientists. Yeah, I don't really know how to answer that question. I think it's part of being human that you will give meaning to things. If we weren't the fact that we're communicating, right, it means we're able to we're imagining GPT as a concept in this conversation. We don't have it directly in front of us. There's no other animals that we know of that are able to even do that small task, just conjure up these fictions fictions like money and things like this. Our whole society runs on a fiction, essentially. And that same ability. Now, I'm not calling spirituality and religion this sort of thing. I'm not going to jump in and call it fiction, but the same power that is in your brain that allows you to deal with concepts like money, it's those same tools and mechanisms that allow us to generate these sort of religious concepts. And there's something to that, right? In the sense that I grew up in sort of a Christian setting, let's say. Your family was originally from India, or you're both English, obviously, but
yeah, my dad was not. He was born in England, but his parents were born in India. He's England born, and then my mum, she's English. She's white English.
Mm-hmm. The thing that I find interesting is that money doesn't really exist. It's a concept, but it does rule the whole world, right? We go to work every day for 8 hours, so the numbers in our bank balance change, right? And so it's very obvious that there are concepts that we fabricate, which nevertheless have sort of a back reaction on the world. And one of my favorite stories is, have you ever read The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz?
No.
This is my favorite book of all time. I highly recommend reading it. But Bernal Diaz was a conquistador who was with Cortez when he destroyed the Aztec civilization, right? When he went into Mexico. And the thing that I found, the reason why it's it's an amazing book is because you get a first-hand account of what it was like to first land in Central and South America. And do yourself a favor, just go get the book and read it. It's very, very good. But the reason why I bring it up is because the people believed that God had given them a mission to go and conquer the people that sort of own the land, right? And it was almost certainly that belief that, if you read the story, you'll see the difficult situations they went through, and they were able to topple a civilization they had like 1,000 men or something, right? If you add up all the men during the entire mission, it was like I'm going to get this wrong, but 1,200 people, let's say, and they toppled a civilization with potentially hundreds of thousands of people inside of it, right? And a big component of that was that they really believed that God had given them this mission, right? They had God on their side. And I think there is power to the notion that, so what religion does and what spirituality does is it gives you a framework, and it's sort of like a communication tool that allows people to act as one in this big cohesive force. And it holds together, much like money does. It held societies together,
like a set of rules for everyone to follow and abide by, and keep everyone.
Yeah, in some sense, in a certain sense, God is real in the sense that it's, even if you don't believe in God, and I'm not religious, but the concept has, the fact that all these different people believe in God makes them act in a certain way, and in that sense, even if you're not religious, it's real, right? In the same sense that money is, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
There's things that are man-made and there's things that are natural.
Yeah, but so to answer my own question, I asked you if you think scientists would make good leaders. And I think your answer was good in the sense that I don't think any particular scientist would make a good leader, and I think scientists are necessary to make good decisions. For example, what sort of COVID policy should we implement, that sort of thing. But if you look at how science is run, I'm kind of skeptical that they would do a better job than the politicians, because science is itself a little bit of a mess.
Why do you say that?
No, science is run off other people's money, right? It doesn't, in general, generate money itself. It's not a closed system. So scientific leaders make, they go out and they ask for grants, and then they have some really small program that they're working on. There are examples of big organizations that have been very successful, like CERN and places like this. But in general, the structures that are implemented by science are very different to the structures that politicians implement. You need your country to be financially viable, otherwise the entire thing collapses. You won't be able to apply for grants. You know what I mean? They're just very different games that the scientists and politicians are playing. But on individual issues, so for example, like I said, how should we respond to COVID or climate change or whatever, you do need scientific advice to make those decisions and make the correct course of action. You need someone who's an expert in that area to advise you correctly. If you're a politician and you've never dealt with climate change, or you've never thought about whatever the topic is of the day that Barack or whatever leader is dealing with at any given time.
Yeah, so like a president or prime minister isn't an expert in one certain area. They're sort of the overseer, and then the people below him, they just delegate the jobs to them and get the feedback and make the decision at the top.
Right, or whatever the structure is. Yeah,
exactly. That's how I imagine the structure. I don't know 100% how it all works, but
one thing that I've always wanted to have a discussion on my podcast about. So a topic that I'm very curious about, and I know nothing about at all, is what political bargaining looks like. So for instance, let's say you're the minister for finance, or whoever you are. What kind of policies do you have to agree to enact in order to gain enough political capital to spend on your own pet topics? If you see what I'm saying. What does it look like as you accumulate political capital to enact the policies that you're personally interested in? And also, what is the trade-off between so in democracy, and if you're the leader in a democracy and you think that some policy is important, where do you draw the line between what you think is important and what your constituents are voting for? So questions like this I'm really curious about, and I'd love to have someone on the podcast that talks about these things. I just haven't found the right way to tell a story. Is this sort of the direction you're interested in your own podcast, or you're more interested in sort of in culture wars and what sort of direction do you want to go with in as you go forward and grow the podcast?
We start talking to a range of people. So, for example, you're our first scientist on, and you've got a completely different view than the last person we had on, Carl, he's an ordinary guy, a landlord from America who's going through some problems. But his story is obviously completely different to yours. We spoke to him about the issues he's facing at the moment with current policies that have been brought into America that's making him, as a small landlord, he's living out of his van because he can't get rid of his tenants that aren't paying him rent, so he can't pay for his mortgage. So he's in a right pickle at the moment. But like this podcast we're doing with you is completely different, and it's given us a different talking points and different ways of looking at the world, and different and trying just to gain a different understanding to enhance our understandings of things.
What is it? Is he going to be able to get out of this situation? What do things look like for him? It sounds horrible.
So they've they've got this scheme where when COVID happened, the tenants were more protected than the landlords. So landlords weren't allowed to evict the tenants. So he's stuck with this tenant, and they've brought in another policy to help the landlords. But he's worried if so what will happen is the government will pay the landlord to pay for his mortgage. But he's worried if he takes that money, then his tenant's locked in for another 12 months, but he wants the tenant out. So he's going through the process at the moment. He said by June, I think he's hoping.
That's the deadline he's put in for himself, hasn't he?
Yeah, but he's struggling at the moment.
So he's losing huge amounts of money. He doesn't have a house, and these tenants, the legal structure doesn't allow him to evict these people, even if he wants to live in the house himself. So it kind of makes sense to me that you should be able to. There should be some protections in place to stop landlords just kicking people out willy-nilly. But if you personally want to live in the house, there should be a path.
And I think that's the process he's going through at the moment for him to move into the house. But he's struggling to get it all through. It's taken longer than he anticipated.
And he wants to kick someone out who's not paying because he can't kick the ones out that are paying. Because if he kicks them out and then he moves in, he won't be able. That's another income stream.
Right. I see. Because he can't afford it in any case. He needs to live in a smaller situation.
Yeah. So it's kind of new to me, the eviction ban it's called the eviction ban, right? In America, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Oh, so he was American.
Yeah, New York. But like the podcast, we would never speak to somebody from New York about who's a small landlord going through these problems. So it's like it's opened our eyes up to somebody who's living a completely different life to us, and just getting an understanding on what their views are on things and understanding what they're struggling with.
Yeah, I guess it's about exploiting the internet to get to know more about the world from first hand. Because obviously, what I wanted to go into with you a bit more as well was you were from Australia and now you've ended up you've been to Canada, which is similar to Australia, not weather-wise, obviously.
Cold Australia.
What would you say it's quite similar in terms of culture?
Yeah, I love Canada. I actually I really disliked Canada when I first arrived. It took me a while to warm to it, but
How old was you when you went there?
I would have been 23, 24, something like that. But I really love Canada. I spent 5 years there, near Toronto. And the thing that I love Canadian people, how hospitable they are. If I had the chance, if I could live anywhere in the world, other than Australia or Germany, I think Canada would be my next choice. I very much enjoyed the holidays and the going out and being in the snow and all that sort of thing. But otherwise, it's probably the closest country to Australia other than England culturally.
So a lot of people say when they've moved from a hot country, they actually get sick of the sun and then they want to move somewhere cold and they appreciate cold weather. Is that true? Because being in England, we can't imagine anyone that gets sick of the sun.
So England is a very different prospect to Canada because your winters are sort of muggy, right? When you're around Toronto, these areas, their snow is real. It sort of hits. You can go ski. Well, around Toronto, it's not very good for skiing, but the snow is deep, and you can actually go walking on the lake, and you get a proper winter. and that can be very enjoyable, right? I went out to friends' sugar shacks where they make maple syrup, and you're there by a wood fire, or you go camping out in the snow. It's a much more pleasant prospect to what we get in Central Europe and where you are in the UK. Yeah, but I would highly recommend, if you've never experienced a proper winter, if you get the opportunity. Maybe it's just me personally. I love it. I like it just as much as a nice summer.
And the summer in Canada is quite nice as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the surprising thing. When I first moved over to Canada, I'm such an idiot. I got rid of a lot of my warm clothing and went over with not nearly enough, and it was scorching when I first arrived. Yeah, so I learned very quickly that it very easily hits 30s in Canada as well. They have beautiful summers and beautiful winters.
So what are you doing? Are you, because obviously you've travelled from country to country. Are you planning to settle somewhere, or are you looking for more places to go and visit? What are you actually doing in each country? Are you learning? Because I know you've studied in certain countries and then worked in certain countries. Is there like an end goal of where you want to be?
There's the dream, and then there's reality. I mean, what I would love ultimately, if I could do it, I would love to live, for example, in Germany from, say, 1st of May through to October, and then Australia for the remainder of the year. Just repeat that. That would be brilliant. But no, so I first moved to Canada to do my master's and PhD. There's a really nice institution that I was very lucky to get into in a small town called Waterloo, which is sort of southwest of Toronto, or mainly west of Toronto. Do you know BlackBerry, the phones? So Mike Lazaridis, who was one of the founders of BlackBerry, decided to build a theoretical physics institute. So he donated some huge amount of money, and I was very lucky to get accepted in for a master's program. And so I did my master's and then my PhD, so my doctorate in, I guess, theoretical physics. So I specialized in a type of geometry and its applications in particle theory. So I did that there in Canada. And then again, I was very fortunate to get a postdoc position at the Max Planck here just outside of Berlin. So so I sort of moved for work. I didn't move for the winter or anything like that. It was really just for work. And there wasn't the equivalent program in Australia for me to. I've always been interested in really fundamental physics and theory in particular. And there were just better opportunities outside of Australia. And so that's why I left ultimately. But if I could, I would like to mix up Australia and maybe Central Europe somewhere.
Right. With what you're doing, I wrote this down and I didn't know whether to ask or not, but I'm going to ask. With what you're doing in physics, are you doing anything around string theory?
So no. No. What I specialize in is sort of to draw a picture of what I do. You're probably familiar with Euclidean geometry, right? When you were in high school, you play around with triangles and squares and this sort of geometry, right? You have sort of a flat sheet and you can draw shapes and lines and angles. So that Euclidean geometry is sort of the geometric setting that Newton played in, right? If you imagine balls dropping and rockets flying, that sort of thing. If those are the objects that you're interested in, then Euclidean geometry is pretty good, right? But then if you, in sort of the start of the 20th century, Einstein worked out special relativity, so dealing with things that are traveling very close to the speed of light. And maybe if you were dealing with sort of relativistic objects, then the geometry you might want is hyperbolic geometry. Then we also discovered quantum mechanics, and sort of the geometry that that you'd play around with there is maybe symplectic geometry. So there are these generalizations of geometry from sort of the Euclidean geometry that you're familiar with from high school. And the one that you're probably most familiar outside of that Euclidean setting is what's called Riemannian geometry, which deals with sort of curved spacetimes. Right? So when people talk about gravity, then you have this sort of this generalization of geometry of Euclidean geometry, which you'd call Riemannian geometry, which deals with curvature and the dynamics of that kind of curvature. So what I deal with is another generalization of geometry, which is it's important, or people find it interesting when you want to deal with a space-time which also has particles inside of it. So the idea is that you have some structure, some geometric structure that you implement in order to describe particles at each point in space-time. So that's what I was playing around with. So my background's in what's called non-commutative geometry. So Cons non-commutative geometry. And I can tell you a little bit more about that if you want, but yeah, it doesn't. So string theory is another approach to quantum gravity. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So yeah, tell us more about what it is that you're currently working on there.
So I don't get much time these days to work on this, but the main problem that I'm interested in at the moment is, so we have this theory called the standard model of particle physics. It's the best theory that we have currently for describing all the particles and forces that we see in experiment. And it's constructed in a language which is called renormalizable quantum field theory. Okay, and this framework is very different to the way you describe gravity. Right? So the standard model of particle physics is a quantum field theory that describes the fact that we see electrons, neutrinos, so there's quarks as well. Then there are the three fundamental forces that are described by the standard model. So the hypercharge, the weak force, and the strong force. And so what would be nice is if you were able to, we know that these two theories, the standard model of particle physics and the way we describe gravity, they don't really play well together. You can't construct your gravitational theories as a renormalizable quantum field theory. And so one of the biggest missions in physics for the past 50 or 100 years, has been to combine these two bits of theory together. And there are various approaches. String theory is one approach. But what I've been interested in is a particular question, which is it possible to describe the standard model geometrically in the same way that you describe gravity? So usually people try to cram gravity into the same framework that people describe particle theories with, but you can go the other way. You can say, well, what would our particle theories look like if we describe them geometrically? And so what that looks like, if you're interested in the non-commutative geometry approach, which is what I'm interested in, is you could imagine. So if you imagine the room that we're in at the moment, there are different ways of coordinatizing this room, right? You might call this point. Does everyone watch on YouTube, or do you have people that just listen to the audio?
Primarily, they just watch on YouTube.
Okay, so I can use my hands and
yeah.
So if you wanted to coordinatize this room, this geometry that we're living in, you might call this point in the room, 1, 3, 4, right? We're in a three-dimensional space, so you use three numbers to describe this location, and this one might be 1, 3, 5 and 1, 3, 6 and so on. so that you associate numbers to all the point, sets of three numbers to every point in space-time, or in space, sorry, in this room. So the way that we coordinatize regular spaces is with numbers, sets of numbers. So I look at geometries where instead of associating a number to each point, you associate more complicated objects, not just a number, but something with more structure, let's say. And the idea is that structure holds information about the sort of particles that can exist in your space. So that's the sort of generalization I'm interested in. And so these geometric spaces, you can't really imagine them, but they're well defined mathematically. And so I'm particularly interested in a question which I've been interested in for a very long time. And the question is, I don't know how much in the way of particle physics you know, but if you go away and you do an experiment, everyone knows about the electron, right? You've heard about the electron. There are 3 types of electron, right? That's something that most people don't know. So there are sort of, for every fermion, every sort of particle that we see, there are 3 copies. And the 3 copies are just heavier versions of the copies that we're familiar. So there's the electron, and then there's sort of a heavier electron and an even heavier electron. And in your everyday life, you only really deal with the lightest ones. The more heavy electrons, let's call them, are unstable, and they'll break down to the electron that we see through various processes, right? So, and no one really knows why. We see these sort of 3 copies of all the matter that exists in the universe, and we don't really know why. And so the main problem that I'm interested in at the moment is trying to explain why those 3 generations exist geometrically.
Okay. When was it? How do you get to that point of your life where you go to school and you don't know much about anything, and to get to the position where you're in, where you're looking at such a complex theory? How does one get from school to the position you're in? How did you come across this question, or how did you come across wanting to burning desire to find the answer?
So first off, I don't think scientists are special necessarily. I think more or less anyone could work on these problems. The main thing is time, right? So the main thing that distinguishes scientists from other people, I would say, is the fact that they're extraordinarily interested and they're specialists in the particular questions that they're interested in, and they've spent a lot of time on them. So for me personally, I wanted to know what we knew about the world. I wanted, because see, this is also one of the reasons why I started the podcast. I was always I love science documentaries. I love there's a lot of great science outreach, but a lot of the time when I would watch a documentary or listen to science journalists talk about science, I was never very satisfied. I would always you can watch this brilliant program, about the cosmos or whatever it is, and there's lots of pretty images, and you sit there and you imagine you know what's going on. And then you realize that once the television turns off, that you can't regurgitate any of the information. So you didn't actually learn as much as you thought you did while watching. And so I really wanted to know, when people talk about string theories, what do they actually mean? And what is an electron? What are these objects that people talk about? And what do we actually know? And what are the open questions? And so I did an undergrad in physics and also one in mechatronics. And then I took the opportunity, because it arose, to go to a master's. And when you start, it's not that I originally had this dream that I wanted to find out, why it is that so we have, as I said, we have this standard model of particle physics, and it has all these details in it, and we don't really understand. we can describe the particles we see, but we don't know why we see those particular particles. We don't know why there's a strong force, and why there's why is it that electrons have the charges they have, and we don't understand the reason for those things that we measure. We just know that that's what we measure in experiment, and these are the models that we have built to describe their dynamics, let's say. So to answer your question about how do you end up interested and with a burning desire for these particular questions, the answer is that you go very slowly, right? You start off as a school kid with no idea what's going on, and you decide you want to do an undergrad, and because it looks cool, and you don't and you sort of blindly walk into, you're just curious at every step.
Well, I guess
I suppose is the answer
with most things, right? You need to, it's quite basic, but you need to learn the fundamentals of anything before, like you said about the when you watch a documentary on TV, something quite complex, yeah, you feel like you've learned a lot, but yeah, when you turn it off, if someone asked you what if you just like listen to, give us the top 10 facts that you've learned from that documentary, you probably won't be able to state them out, because we don't know the foundations and the fundamentals of that certain topic. So yeah, I get what you mean. To get to the level you're at, you need to first have a desire for the subject at whole, and then sort of go a level further and a level deeper and a level further and a level deeper, and then that's how obviously you must have got to.
Yeah, you need to spend time. I mean, so I have this experience, or I'll be at a party or speaking to people, and they'll ask what I do, or they will ask me about some physics problem, and very often I get the impression when I speak to people that they don't think they will understand what I'm talking about, and so they just check out. It's like it's like they've made the decision, I'm not going to be able to understand this, so I'm not going to engage with. I'm asking the question out of politeness, but I'm actually not going to engage with the answer, because I don't think either it's not interesting, or I don't think that I'm going to be able to digest it, whatever it is that's being said. And I think one of the things that scientists are good at is breaking down problems into smaller pieces that are digestible and working through them. And if the average person realized that they could actually digest even very complicated concepts, if they had the opportunity, the average person, or not the average person, you had this other guest on your podcast, right? Who had all this trouble with his house. He was dealing with this eviction, and he was essentially on the street living in his car. That person doesn't have the opportunity to think about, why do we see three generations of particles in the Standard Model? Why is it that gravitational waves act in this particular way? Why, he is very much dealing with what's immediate in his life, and he doesn't have the opportunity. That doesn't mean he's stupid, or you know what I mean? What I'm trying to say is that the big thing that separates scientists from non-scientists is that they have had the opportunity, first of all, and that they're curious, and they took advantage of the fact that they were curious to build up the opportunity in many cases. So
and what you said as well about taking the time, that's definitely a fundamental part of it, because I can imagine, I've not been in this situation, obviously not being a scientist, I can't ever have been in that situation of being at a party, but I understand the scenario where you're trying to explain something to someone but they're only asking you out of politeness, and maybe in a different setting that same person could be more patient and hear you out and actually use their mind to try and understand what it is that you're talking about. A lot of people unwillingly and subconsciously only want to put their mind on subjects they care about. If they don't care about it, then subconsciously they're just going to tune out and they're just going to move on to talk to someone else who maybe, I don't know, watched the Kardashians last week, because that's where they want their mind to go. But there are people, them same people, who put them in a different setting, maybe add them into this podcast for a chat. They on the podcast, you've turned your phone off. You're away from you. Even though you're in technology, you are disconnected from everything, and you're tuning into someone else's experience, someone else's story. So it kind of, and that's another perk of the podcast game, I guess. It kind of gives you build that patience and that time to listen to someone, and I guess it's different with us because we genuinely have an interest in learning about this stuff. But I am seeing, with the way technology is and the way social media is, a lot of people unplug a lot faster than if you was to have that same conversation with someone 20 years ago when social media wasn't around. They would probably be slightly more inclined to listen and to understand and to have that patience.
Yeah, you can sort of see already like people's attention spans aren't that great because we can see it with the YouTube shorts. We used to do one. This sounds crazy, right? We used to do 1 minute shorts, and I said to Cam, well, we weren't getting much traction on them. So I said to Cam, well, maybe we should try doing 20 to 30 seconds. We started doing that, and we seem to be getting more traction on those ones. And I can't believe people can't focus for an extra 30 seconds and now
but it's terrible, right? It's
yeah.
So I'm personally very addicted to my phone, and I consume information on my phone and my computer like crazy. I'm just always reading something. That's where I find my guests for the podcast. But it's not. So I'm not a neuroscientist or anything like this, but I imagine what's happening to my brain is that I scroll to some new article, which is, I can read in a few seconds. I read the article, the headline, and I get that dopamine hit. Then I scroll to the next one, and I don't need to remember anything from the article I just read. There's not going to be a test later. There's no obligation on my side to do anything with the information that I've just consumed. And so if you're scrolling, again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but what I imagine you're doing is you're training your brain to just ignore all the information that's coming into it because it's not going to be used later on. You're squashing your attention span and making your brain just useless. And I've noticed the effect. So recently I started going for runs in the morning, every morning, and trying to completely disconnect from my phone and from social media, not because I don't find it interesting and not because there's nothing valuable there, but because it trains my brain, I think, to act in a setting that I don't think is very useful for anything of value that I have in my life. But yeah, so yeah, this attention span thing is definitely a problem. I must say, for me personally.
Have you ever used TikTok, or do you use TikTok?
I don't use TikTok.
Have you ever used it?
I've scrolled through it a little bit. I've probably spent an hour on TikTok in total.
Right. Okay. I had it must be over a year ago now, and within a month of using it, I had to just delete it off my phone because I don't know what it is like. You can feel what it is in your mind, but it's hard to explain what it is. But I could go on it at 9 p.m. at night, and I'll be on it just scrolling till midnight. 3 hours of just pure scrolling.
Did you find it easy to go cold turkey, or was it difficult for you to stop?
I knew I had to stop. When I got to a point where that's where I stopped. When I looked at the time, and it was 12 a.m. I hadn't been watching TV. Usually, I would get into bed. I would watch TV or read a book for an hour just to switch off. I was wired watching TikTok. I looked at the time, and then when I woke up the next morning, I was like, my mind still feels a bit weird. And
Is it that addictive?
I just need to disconnect from it and get rid of it. Yeah, it was that bad. And I'm still here. I've talked to people about it now. And I was talking to a client of mine from my other side of my life. And his kid is 11 or 12. They just got a phone anyway because they're just going to high school. And he looked at the watch time of his kid's phone per day on TikTok, and he was doing 6 to 7 hours a day on TikTok. And that was on a a normal school day. So this app is that dopamine. They call it a weapon, but what they've got on the app is gold for whoever's created it, I guess, for the purpose.
Because each clip starts immediately, and you can just think to yourself, I'm just going to watch this last one, and then whatever. I can go sleep or do some work or whatever it is that I want to do. But then the next one comes, and I'll just watch. It's just 20 seconds, and it's just 20 seconds, and it's just 20 seconds. And then I suppose 6 hours passes.
And you don't realize that all these 20 seconds are, because it's just 20 seconds, when like you spend £2 or $2 or €2 here, €2 there, you don't actually count that into the bigger grand scheme of spending. For some reason, psychologically, it just doesn't. Other than if you were going to spend £100 or €100 on something, you would think more about that. I think it's the same sort of format they've got there, because it's just 20 seconds, just quick ones. You're just thinking, oh, I would just watch another one. Because if you watch a movie which is 2 hours long, you wouldn't put another movie on afterwards, really. But you would watch 5 episodes of a series and think, because you think, oh, they're only half an hour, they're only 45 minutes.
It won't waste the rest of my day. And then the worst part about it is, if you get to 4 hours in, you're like, oh, I've wasted the day anyway. What work can I do now? I may as well just treat myself to a few more episodes of whatever it is that you're interested in. I think so that it's definitely a weakness of the platform that you're running and which I'm running. I think my average episode would be 2 hours or an hour and a half, something like that. The longest interview I gave was 7 hours, something like this.
Wow.
And I broke that into 2 episodes. Just because it was.
You do that with no breaks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Didn't eat or stop at all.
We didn't stop. It just kept going. And I also have had episodes that I have a lot of content outside of the actual interview that is published. And some of my favorite ones as well. So there's a lot of material there that isn't being published, even though I don't make any cuts almost no cuts. So there are a few, occasionally there are bits and pieces that get cut out at the request of the guest, but more or less everything goes on as you see it. Occasionally there'll be some problem with equipment, and that forces me to make cuts. But yeah, no, I'm very conscious of the fact that this is not necessarily the best way to grow the platform, for sure. I should be using our dopamine and other
exploiting it, right? Another thing as well is, if you go on TikTok, when you first go onto it, this is something I've discovered sort of since deleting it, they will flood you with bright colours to begin with to get you, or sort of whatever flowing in your body. But also with YouTube, if you create a whole new account or a new page and access a clean slate of YouTube, if you look down all the thumbnails that are sort of not within an algorithm, you'll see all these bright coloured thumbnails using blues, yellows, greens, pinks, just all over the place, just to really get you going. And it sort of feels like you're in what probably paradise would be envisioned as when you go onto these clean slate, no algorithm platforms. But then when I go into mine now, not much color on my algorithm one. There's not much color coming out of it. I don't know if it's sort of a reflection of me and my algorithm.
Just a very grey person. I have a technique that I've used to break addiction that I haven't really heard many people talking about, but which I find very useful. So maybe you guys will find it interesting as well. Many years ago, I was very addicted to Reddit. And there are other aggregate sites that I've looked at, like Quora and places like this, because I just find it very interesting reading all sorts of things about the world. But it's not very good for my productivity, so I have to get rid of these things. And I found that if I just went cold turkey and I just stopped, I would start to drift back to it after a few weeks. But one technique that I use, which was it works for me really well, is I would find someone who also has an addiction. a similar thing. I go on YouTube too much, or I go on this too much, or I do that too much. And I would make a bet with them that you have to stick to. The loser has to buy the other one, 10 beers or something like this. And somehow actually it doesn't even have to be that big, but having that very small bit of accountability behind you, it works wonders for me. I don't know how long ago now, 10 years ago or 7 years ago or something, I just completely stopped reading Reddit using this mechanism. So it's
one thing I do to sort of counteract addictions. So I wouldn't say I was massively addicted, but do you know when you just sat there wasting time on social media? So I was scrolling once on Instagram, and it must have been, like Cam said, the time just flies by when you're just scrolling. So I just sat there and I thought, I'm going to delete the app. So I just deleted the app, but I allowed myself to access it through the browser. So I just tapped in www.instagram.com, made it more difficult for me to get on it. So it's not just unlock your phone and the first thing you press is Instagram. I have to go into Google Chrome and type it in and go in and access it that way. Since I've done that, I barely even use Instagram anymore. So I've sort of introduced that technique into like my working day as well. So if I find I'm going on my phone too much, I'll put my phone upstairs in my room and then work, because it makes it hard for me to go and access my phone then, rather than having it right next to you where you can just pick it up.
The ease of access is completely gone.
Yeah, that's how I sort of counteract it.
The thing about having your phone out when you're working, and definitely within my sort of work, because mine's pretty creative and sometimes you got to wait even a couple of seconds for something to load. When you're waiting for something to load, I automatically just pick up my phone, even if the thing's only going to take 5 to 10 seconds to load. And then I end up being on my phone for, even if it's 30 seconds to a minute, the thing's already loaded. And then I come back into the zone and I'm like, right, what was I doing again?
That's the other thing. You need to be bored to be creative, I think, for me personally. My most productive times these days are when I'm on a long plane trip or when I'm on a train trip somewhere, because I'm completely disconnected from everything, and I can just work with no interruptions of any sort. I should just spend all my time on trains. I think it'd be the ideal office for me. But that's another thing about your question. How do you get from being a high school student through to working in some area of research? You definitely need to be bored at some point along there. You need to pour time into it. But I don't know if I answered your question well enough when it comes to how do you get into a certain position.
Oh, kind of, because what I was trying to get to with it was basically what you've said, right? It takes a lot of commitment. When you say commitment, it takes a lot of willpower to get into such a I don't know if we call it technical. What would you call it? It's such a specific part of physics that you're in. What I was my side question after that was going to be, do you guys within the science industry, or do you as an individual ever think about the up and coming scientists of the next generation? Are they going to be able to, I guess it does sort of benefit, we've just gone on that tangent about social media, because are they going to be able to commit to this sort of lifestyle? And is that something you've ever thought about, or is that anything that worries the industry?
Do you mean because of an attention deficit, or for other reasons?
Well, because of primarily attention. Like, are people going to be able to?
Lack of boredom.
People are bored because TikTok's available. And if everyone's on TikTok, because I know the TikTok in China is different to the TikTok in the West. The TikTok in China would probably push you to become a scientist.
Yeah, they actually prevent you from watching the Kardashians or whoever. Yeah. So generally speaking, I'm worried about attention spans and that sort of thing. But when it comes to science specifically, I'm worried about other things. So the things that I am concerned with are things like one thing that concerns me is that the universities are essentially businesses. And so the structure that they implement through which people do science is put in place to benefit universities. It's not put in place to benefit scientists, science, or the government that funds the universities necessarily. And it's those sort of things that worry me and concern me most when it comes to the future of research and who's going to be doing it. So to give you an example, it's quite beneficial for universities to. So when I did my postdoc, when I moved from Canada to Germany, I had a 2-year position. And in theoretical physics, you need to apply for jobs 1 year before you end your contract. Sort of you get your job, you finish off your contract, then you start the new one. And so what that meant is that exactly 1 year after I started my postdoc, I had to apply for a job again, right? And then I got a 1-year extension, which meant that then I had to apply again. And so I went through 5 years applying for jobs at every single point during my postdoc at the Max Planck. And that sounds fine when you think about it to start with, but the competition is so high that you have to apply for a lot of jobs to guarantee that you'll get a position at the next stage. And so you have people out there that are spending months of every year on job applications rather than on research. And this is across all of science. It's worse in some fields than others, particularly ones that have low funding or higher competition, or where lots of people want to be working in that area. And essentially, universities, they construct their own supply-demand curve, right? Because they generate the PhDs and they employ them, if you know what I'm saying. So they can set up a system which has everyone squabbling for positions, and they sort of suck the youth out of every generation that comes through. And a very small percentage of postdocs and young scientists who, people go in with very bright eyes and they want to make the world better, and they're very curious. And what I'm concerned about is a lot of these people end up sort of very disgruntled and pushed out the other side of the machine. And I think it's quite sad, because I know a lot of very good scientists, excellent scientists, who struggled the whole way through their young careers. And so anyway, so it's those sort of things that concern me. And another thing that concerns me is So if you're a country, if you're let's say, for example, you're a government and you're interested in bringing clever people into the country. You're England, you're the English king, and you want to increase the number of clever people coming in. What you would like is to suck in smart people and have them stay. But the way that our institutions work currently is you have a bunch of young people that come in for 1 or 2 years, or maybe 3 years on a young postdoc. And because they're so concentrated on the fact that their contract is going to end and they're going to be starting a new one, and they have to find a job, and they need to get publications out, and they need to invest in all these things that have nothing to do with science necessarily, or their careers or anything, but just in staying employed. These young people don't invest themselves in the local community where they're doing their postdocs, where they're doing their short contracts. So it's very typical. I'm in Germany. It's very typical that you'll have a guy come from India or someone come from America, and they'll come in, they'll spend 2 years in Berlin, and then they'll leave and off they go. They'll go to their next appointment somewhere. And so there is no staying power. Germany is not benefiting from the fact that it sucked in that person. That's okay. They're there for 2 years. But if you had a position, right, that if you had a fixed contract that was 4 or 5 years, then that person they'll find a partner locally. They'll become invested in the local community. And a large percentage of people they go into industry after research careers. And if you're paying the bill for the, if you're funding science, then wouldn't it be good if those tax dollars, if they go not only to the science, but actually bringing people in and getting them to stay in the area and build up the local economy? And so there's something fundamentally wrong, I feel, with the way that universities are currently being run. And so and I can talk about this at length because I'm interested not in only on the science, but also, for me personally, if I have a successful scientific career, I can discover something. Let's say I can discover why there are 3 generations of particles, or whatever the thing is that I want to discover. But if I can have a slightly positive influence on the system itself more broadly, then 1,000 scientists are going to come after me that do epsilon better. And ultimately the positive impact will be much larger. And so I'm very concerned. I would like, if I can, to help generate systems within science which allow scientists to do science better. So that's one thing that this is a very long-winded answer.
No, it's really good. So does any of that connect with what you're doing on the technology side? Or have you thought about ways to connect with your machine learning side to rejig the system around a little bit? Or at least it might have been a thought that's just gone into mind. It might not be something that you're progressively doing.
It's one of the reasons why I'm doing the podcast. So I've been involved in institutions building. So there's a new institution called the DZA that's being built in Saxony. So I played a small role in that institution, getting the funding, and it's being constructed now. But no, the direction I would go is not technological, more sociological.
So, are there other scientists calling for this sort of issue to be resolved in the system?
Of course. Yeah. This is a big topic within science. You see it in what you would hear about is that you would hear things like women in science and things like this. People are very concerned about helping women in areas where they're underrepresented, and this is sort of one side of the coin, or one small aspect of a broader problem in science, which is just very visible when it comes to, for example, minorities in science or women in science. But it's sort of like the canary in the coal mine, let's say. There are broader issues that people are very concerned with. Yeah.
That issue wouldn't exist at all if there was no one to actually conduct science. The minorities or the women in science. So yeah, like you said, there is a broader issue. So is that why you've got funding? I don't know if this is something you want to talk about, but why you got funding for the YouTube channel?
Somewhat. I was very fortunate that I was able to get funding to help me work on the podcast, because I wouldn't have time otherwise, because of my other projects and work and so on. So I'm very interested in working out ways of self-funding institutions. So I would like to find out if there are ways of breaking out of apply for a grant, do your work. So the way that universities currently function, if you think about it, is if you go and look at the average professor, what that professor does is they sell their time to the university. They say, I'm going to do so and so many hours teaching a week, or administration, or whatever it is. And in exchange, I get to work in this fantastic place with some of the smartest people in the world on this problem that I'm interested in. And they've done these studies where they look at the percentage of time that professors spend on their actual research. Sometimes it's as low as 17% of their time, right? There are these large commitments that don't necessarily have anything to do with research. Teaching is wonderful. Of course, it's brilliant that good teaching is being done, but there's other burdens like administrative burdens and so on. So what I'm interested in is asking the question. One of the questions I'm interested in is it possible to sell your time differently? Rather than selling your time to a university, is there a different way of going about things? So imagine you had a situation where you constructed an institution in which you earned money for the researchers through science outreach, or that's one possibility. Or there are different possibilities I'm looking at. And so initially, the podcast, I mean, I want to do the podcast for many different reasons. One of the reasons is I want to create a more authentic view of science. I currently, the way that we view science is that there's some Einstein in the ivory tower, who's some genius that has a spark of intellect or a spark of inspiration, and then they go to a glass window and write down big long formulas.
It's been marketed
the camera
that
looks
way, though, hasn't it? Science.
Yeah, but really, there's huge collaborations, and the people that are doing science are just normal people that are just very driven and have the time and the opportunity to work in a certain area. So there's that aspect. I want to create a more authentic view of what science actually is and who scientists are. I want to allow people who otherwise wouldn't have access to science, like real science. If you want to go find out about whatever subject it is, the opportunities you have is science journalism, reading online, but you don't really know where to read, or going and looking at the papers, right? There's not really many avenues for the average person. So the podcast was an attempt to give people the opportunity to see what that scientist specifically actually thinks about a topic at length. And so you get to grasp some of the ideas that they're mulling with and really see what it looks like. But then there's the other reason why I started the podcast, and that was to see how difficult is it how much time do you need to spend to build up an audience? How difficult is it to interest people in science? Is this a way that you could sell your time as a researcher if you wanted to construct an institute that was based off? And so this is just one of the ideas. I'm very interested in the background. I have various projects on in the background. I'm very interested in creating, because the scientific structures are wonderful for many people, but for other people, they're not. And so I want to see if there are different ways of playing the game. And so this is just one aspect of that sort of drive.
Yeah, that's actually really, really amazing. It's not something really that is publicized a lot about. We call it the struggles in the science industry. It's not really publicized much for someone that's outside of the industry. You don't really hear much about it. I hear about the problems with universities and the way universities are set up, but that's sort of across the board, so to speak. Universities, like you said, they are just a business. And I guess that's where capitalism sort of plays its part in science then, because at the end of it, the university still needs to make money from this whole, from anything they do. There's someone sat at the top who knows absolutely zero about science, that's looking at a spreadsheet of numbers and saying, this number needs to be higher, what can you do? And it results in scientists, it results in many different ground level people in industry suffering from the choices that universities make.
Of course, it's a great privilege to be able to work on essentially your own ideas and to have people that are curious to listen to. It's amazing that you can go. I've given talks in front of large numbers of extraordinarily intelligent people on my research, and they've sat there listening and sort of it's a tremendous privilege to be able to do that. And you have to be realistic, as you said. These are businesses and they have to make money, and how do they do that? But so I I guess I don't really want to point the finger at universities and say they're doing a bad job or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying necessarily. What I'm saying is, I think there are other games that can be played. And I think this will become increasingly clear as time goes on. Well, at least I hope it will become increasingly clear. And so without pointing the finger and saying universities are archaic or anything like this, I just want to say there are other ways. And,
well, yeah, I've got the impression that what you're actually, the way you've explained it is, an entry into science is somewhat monopolized into universities. There's no alternative routes in, if I'm not mistaken, and there should be, to keep everything fresh and to keep new. Science is all about new ideas, right? So the new way of setting up a career in science or progression in science might mean taking an alternative route rather than just a university.
Exactly. And so if you went back in time to the 1700s, say, and you look at who was doing science, it was the extraordinarily wealthy people who had means, right? They were able to, they had the time and they could afford the expensive glassware, let's say. And in fact, when you study physics, if you get good physics lecturers, one thing that they will do is they gift you with not just physics, but the lore associated with physics. So you learn all about Tycho Brahe and his exploding bladder, or you hear about Kepler and was it Kepler with a golden nose? You hear about all these wonderful stories, and part of that is you learn about the fact that a lot of the big guys they had Lord out the front of their name, right? And these days, universities are brilliant, but we're starting to see institutions founded by, again, wealthy people. But you have, for example, the Premier Institute, which is where I did my PhD and my master's. That came from private funding to a large extent. There's also public funding now behind that institution. But we're starting to see different ways of doing things, but more or less everyone still is based either at a large government institution or a university. And to some extent, I don't really see that changing. But what I see changing is potentially the funding mechanisms behind. So if I was to build my own institution today, I would still want to embed the institution somehow within the current structure. You still need to have competence built into the whatever you build, right? Accreditation and so forth. But it would be nice if there were just different mechanisms available to people.
Yeah, I agree.
Would having different mechanisms available to people, would that make the universities more sort of competitive on their side and make them better?
I think so. So it's a good question, because I started off by saying that universities are doing things to benefit universities, not to necessarily benefit science or the individuals. So, and your question is, I guess I could understand your question in two ways. I could understand it as, would this benefit universities economically, and would it make universities better as scientific institutions? I'm guessing you were looking for the second question, right?
Yeah, well, I'm guessing if a university is better as a scientific institution, then it's going to benefit it economically, like further down the line anyway. Is that right?
I don't know. I'm not. Yeah, I don't know. So obviously, at the moment, there are these Ivy Leagues that have huge endowments, right? And it's very hard. You can play this game. Go to your favorite university and go look at the CVs of all the professors there. And you'll see that a large number of those professors did their PhDs and postdocs at sort of top institutions. What happens is those top guys sort of filter into to the other institutions often, but, because they're more employable, let's say. And So it must be very difficult for the average university to break the monopoly of these huge. In the UK, you've got Cambridge and you've got Oxbridge. What do you call it, right? And you've got
Oxbridge.
What do you call it? You've got there's a term for the top tier of universities in the UK. What is it? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I can't remember the name. I know there is one. I can't remember it though.
But it must be very difficult to break that hold and to break into that top tier. And I suppose if there are different funding mechanisms which allow, let's imagine you can work anywhere, then because you're being you have a different source of funding and you don't have to be tied to wherever it is, then maybe there'll be other draws on people. So for instance, why live at the moment? There are many institutions that are built in the middle of nowhere because it's cheap to build institutions in the middle of nowhere. But maybe I want to go live in Newcastle, Australia, and I have my own funding. So I can bring my own funding to Newcastle, Australia. Why don't I go there? I can take my family there and so on. Maybe additional streams or different avenues of access to science and scientific funding will break down monopolies in that sort of way, because now I don't have to go work where you tell me I have to work for financial reasons. Yeah. Will it make it at universities better? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm more concerned with the actual science that's being done across more generally. Yeah.
Is it called the Russell Group?
That's the one.
Yeah, it's a group of 24 of the UK's top. Yeah, shall we wrap this one up?
It's great. Thanks again for inviting me on. So it's been a pleasure. Nice to speak to you both.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Cheers, Shane.
Bye, everyone.